On a winter evening in Melbourne, when rain slicked the cobblestone laneways and streetlights shimmered across puddles like liquid amber, the city breathed that peculiar mix of solitude and electricity that only winter brings. The scent of roasted coffee still clung to the air long after cafes had closed, drifting through doorways and mingling with the faint hum of passing trams. It was June 15th, 2005, the night Emma Fraser stepped out of a crowded art gallery in Fitzroy and disappeared into a silence that would echo through her family's life for nearly 20 years. The exhibition she attended wasn't grand, but it was vibrant, a modest showing of local artists whose work pulsed with raw urban emotion. On the exposed brick walls hung bold collages of painted figures layered over faded photographs, pieces that seemed to whisper of loneliness amid noise, of human beings dissolving quietly into the chaos of the city. Ironically, the art spoke of vanishing, and that night one of its admirers would do exactly that. Emma had arrived just after 7, wrapped in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans, her favorite vintage leather boots soft from years of use. Her auburn hair was loosely tied back, and she carried herself with the unassuming grace of someone comfortable in her own quietness. Friends would later recall how alive she seemed that evening, her hands moving animatedly as she discussed texture, contrast, and emotion in art. There was light in her voice, a warmth that made people lean in when she spoke. At 29, Emma Fraser lived a life balanced delicately between motion and stillness. She taught yoga each morning at a Brunswick Street studio, her voice a calm tether for students lost in breath and posture. Her afternoons were her own, spent creating art in the spare bedroom of her Richmond apartment, often with her cat perched nearby as silent company. Among friends, she was known for her reflective nature, her quiet intelligence, and a way of seeing the world that felt both tender and precise, like she was always observing the hidden currents beneath ordinary life. The gallery that night, a narrow space on Gertrude Street, pulsed with chatter and the clink of wine in plastic cups. By 9:30, the crowd began to thin, leaving the hum of soft conversation and distant music from a nearby pub. Emma lingered near the entrance, chatting with the gallery owner, thanking her for the evening, mentioning she'd be heading home soon. Several witnesses saw her near the doorway. One recalled her glancing at her silver flip phone, the kind that snapped shut with a satisfying click. Another remembered her wave goodbye, her silhouette framed briefly against the glow of the street before she stepped out into the night. The air outside was cool, damp with the kind of chill that rises from the Yarra River and seeps into the city's bones. The faint sound of trams rattled along Smith Street, their lights sliding across the wet pavement. Music drifted through the darkness, laughter from a nearby pub cut briefly through the hum, and then faded. Somewhere in that small, ordinary pocket of time, Emma Fraser vanished. She never made it to the tram stop. She never returned to her Richmond apartment, where her cat waited faithfully by the door through the night and into the next day. Her housemate, Sarah Thompson, didn't think much of it at first. Emma was independent, spontaneous, but by the following afternoon, unease turned to alarm. Emma hadn't shown up for her morning class. She hadn't called. She hadn't left a note. It was entirely unlike her. Sarah dialed Emma's phone again and again. It rang each time, echoing into emptiness, until finally it went silent, swallowed by either a dead battery or something far worse. That was the beginning of the mystery. The night when art imitated life too closely, when a woman who pondered the meaning of isolation became, herself, a haunting symbol of disappearance. By the evening of June 16th, the unease that had been growing in Claire Fraser's chest hardened into dread. She drove down from Bendigo beneath a slate-grey sky, headlights cutting through the drizzle as she tried to quiet the voice inside her that kept whispering what she refused to believe, that something had gone terribly wrong. Claire was 32, a primary school teacher, mother of 2, the steady one in the family. She knew Emma's patterns by heart, the morning yoga sessions, the habitual evening tea, the texts that always came if she was running late. Emma didn't vanish, she didn't forget, she didn't just not show up. When Claire reached the Richmond apartment, the silence was suffocating. The air held that stillness that lingers when someone hasn't been home for a while. No warmth, no movement, only absence pressing against the walls. Emma's bed was untouched, the duvet smooth as if it had never been turned down. Her yoga mat was rolled neatly in the corner. Her work bag still hung from the hook by the door, and her half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, a thin film of dust gathering on the surface. Everything in its place, except her. Claire's pulse pounded as she called the police. The officer who arrived was kind, efficient, and most infuriatingly measured. He took notes with calm detachment, assuring her that most missing adults turned up within 48 hours. Sometimes people just need space, he said. They go off-grid for a bit. His words were procedural, meant to soothe, but they scraped against Claire's nerves. He didn't know Emma. Emma didn't go off-grid. Emma didn't walk away from her cat, her students, or her life. But Claire swallowed her anger, forcing her voice steady as she handed over photos, descriptions, details. the charcoal sweater, the vintage boots, the silver flip phone she kept in her jacket pocket. The gallery owner confirmed the timeline. Emma had left around 9:45 that night. After that, nothing. The street outside had been busy, crowded with Friday night laughter and music spilling from bars, a blur of strangers weaving between puddles. Yet in that endless motion, no one remembered seeing her again. It was the cruel paradox of city life, how someone could vanish in plain sight, surrounded by hundreds of people. The police reviewed what little surveillance footage existed, but in 2005, cameras were sparse and their images unreliable. A few caught indistinct shapes moving through static, ghostly outlines fading in and out of focus. Nothing identifiable, no direction of travel, no trace, just fragments of a night dissolving into grainy silence. For 2 weeks the city held its breath. Flyers appeared on poles and cafe windows. News reports showed Emma's smiling face, a photo taken on a brighter day, when she had no idea her image would become part of an unsolved mystery. And then on June 29th, something surfaced. A jogger running along the Yarra River noticed a flash of green wedged between rocks along the muddy bank near South Bank Promenade. It was a canvas mochila, Emma's bag. The fabric was dark and frayed at the corners, damp but not waterlogged, as though it had been partially shielded by the overhanging brush that arched above the river's slow current. The discovery sent ripples through the investigation. Inside, detectives found the quiet remains of a life mid-sentence. Her sketchbook, its pages swollen and rippled from moisture, was filled with pencil drawings, the outlines of old buildings, studies of faces caught in half-light abstract forms layered with notes on color and emotion. Her wallet was still inside, holding her driver's license. Emma smiling faintly in the photo, looking younger, softer, along with a Medicare card, a library card, and a crumpled receipt from a Carlton cafe dated June 14th, just one day before she vanished. But there was no cash, no credit cards. Her keys were there, attached to a small keychain shaped like a painter's palette. A small makeup pouch held nothing unusual: lip balm, a compact mirror, a few stray hair ties. Folded between the pages of her sketchbook was a flyer from the art exhibition, slightly torn along one edge. The police noted every item with meticulous care, but what they didn't find spoke even louder. Emma's phone was missing, so was the jacket she had worn that night, the one that had held the phone in its pocket. No signs of blood, no torn fabric, no indication of violence. Just a bag, gently weathered by river air, resting where someone, or something, had left it. It was as if the Yarra had conspired with time itself, washing away meaning and leaving behind only fragments. The river had done what rivers always do. It had carried away the story, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. And for Clea, standing by that same water days later, staring at the place where her sister's bag had been found, one truth settled cold and heavy inside her. Emma hadn't simply walked away. Something had taken her from the world, and the world had quietly swallowed the evidence. Detective Senior Constable Michael Harris took the lead on the case. A veteran of Victoria Police with 15 years of experience and a reputation for thoroughness, he stood on the riverbank that afternoon watching forensic officers photograph the bag from multiple angles and felt the familiar weight of a case that would resist easy answers. The location troubled him. South Bank was miles from Fitzroy, across the river and away from any logical route Emma might have taken home. Had she walked here herself? Had someone brought her? The bag's placement felt almost deliberate, visible enough to be found, but not so conspicuous as to draw immediate attention. Interviews began in concentric circles, radiating out from Emma's last known movements. Detectives spoke with everyone at the gallery opening, compiling a list of attendees from the sign-in sheet and cross-referencing it with witness statements. They tracked down the other artists, the gallery staff, the people who'd purchased wine and admired paintings. Most remembered seeing Emma, but couldn't provide specific details about her departure. The city's transient nature worked against the investigation. People had been drinking, socializing, moving between venues. Memories blurred and contradicted. Adam Sullivan emerged as a person of interest almost immediately, Emma's ex-boyfriend, 34 years old, manager of a bar called the Owl on Chapel Street. They dated for 18 months before breaking up in March, 3 months before Emma's disappearance. Friends described the relationship as intense and turbulent. Sullivan was charming but possessive, the kind of man who called too frequently and showed up unannounced. The breakup had been Emma's decision, and according to her housemate Sarah, Sullivan hadn't taken it well. He'd sent flowers, written letters, appeared outside the yoga studio where Emma taught, nothing overtly threatening but persistent in a way that crossed from romantic into uncomfortable. Detectives brought Sullivan in for questioning on July 2nd. He arrived with a lawyer, a calculated move that immediately raised Harris's suspicions, though he understood it was also the smart thing to do. Sullivan was composed, his answers measured. Yes, he'd been upset about the breakup. Yes, he'd tried to reconcile with Emma. but he hadn't seen her in weeks, and on the night of June 15th, he'd been working at the Owl until 2 in the morning. His staff confirmed this. Security footage from the bar showed him behind the counter, mixing drinks, interacting with customers. His alibi appeared solid, frustratingly so. The incident room at St Kilda Road Police Headquarters became a shrine to absence, walls papered with photographs of Emma Fraser smiling at camera angles that now felt like glimpses into a life interrupted mid-sentence. Detective Senior Constable Michael Harris stood before the evidence board each morning, with coffee going cold in his hand, studying the timeline that refused to cohere into narrative. June 15th, 9:45 p.m., last confirmed sighting. June 29th, bag discovered. Between these points lay a void that swallowed every logical explanation and offered nothing substantial in return. Investigation moved through Emma's world like an archaeologist, sifting through layers of a life. Her apartment in Richmond revealed a woman of careful habits and quiet passions. Books on art history lined shelves alongside yoga philosophy texts. Her refrigerator held fresh vegetables and a half-empty bottle of white wine. The spare bedroom she used as a studio smelled of acrylic paint and turpentine. Canvases in various states of completion leaned against walls. Nothing appeared disturbed. Her laptop, examined by digital forensics, showed a browsing history of art supply websites, email exchanges with gallery owners, and searches for meditation retreats in the Dandenong Ranges. The last email she'd sent was on June 14th, confirming her attendance at the exhibition opening. Detectives interviewed her yoga students, who described Emma as patient and intuitive, someone who remembered personal details and asked about their lives with genuine interest. They spoke with her housemate, Sarah Thompson, at length, a graphic designer who'd shared the Richmond apartment with Emma for 2 years. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank, and told them about the messages. Emma had been receiving them for weeks before she disappeared. Sarah explained that the anonymous text messages on her phone were never explicitly threatening but unsettling in their familiarity. They referenced places Emma had been, things she'd done. Saw your new painting today, the one with the blue figures, powerful work. Or you look tired after your morning class, hope you're taking care of yourself. Emma had mentioned them casually at first, assuming they came from someone who'd seen her at the gallery or attended her yoga sessions. But as they continued, her tone had shifted from bemusement to unease. The problem was the phone. Without it, detectives couldn't access her message history or trace the sender. They obtained her mobile records from the provider, which showed incoming calls and texts but not their content. The anonymous messages came from different numbers, all prepaid phones purchased with cash untraceable. Technical experts explained this required premeditation, someone who understood how to remain invisible. The last message Emma received came on June 15th at 7:12 p.m. while she was already at the gallery opening. The call log showed it, but whatever words it contained had vanished with her phone. Adam Sullivan agreed to a second interview, this time without his lawyer present, a gesture Harris interpreted as either confidence or calculation. Sullivan sat across the interview table in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were careful. He acknowledged sending Emma flowers after the breakup and admitted he'd hoped they might reconcile, but insisted he'd accepted her decision by May. When Harris asked about the anonymous messages, Sullivan's expression didn't change. He knew nothing about them, he said. Emma hadn't mentioned them to him. They'd barely spoken since March. His phone records supported this claim, showing no contact with Emma's number after April 3rd, but friends painted a different picture. Jessica Wilson, Emma's closest friend since university, told detectives about an incident in late May when Sullivan had appeared at a cafe where Emma was meeting Jessica for lunch. He'd approached their table, tried to join the conversation, and only left when Emma firmly told him to go. Jessica described him as desperate rather than angry, but added that Emma had felt increasingly uncomfortable with his persistence. Another friend, Marcus Anderson, who worked at a bookshop on Gertrude Street near the gallery, mentioned seeing Sullivan walking past the store several times in early June, always alone, always glancing through the windows as if searching for someone. The surveillance footage from the night Emma disappeared offered nothing but frustration. Cameras along Smith Street captured grainy images of pedestrians, but the resolution was too poor for facial identification, and the angles too limited to show side streets. One camera outside a restaurant on Gertrude Street had recorded the gallery entrance intermittently, its motion sensor triggering only when groups passed by. Forensic video analysts enhanced the footage frame by frame, isolating a figure that might have been Emma leaving around the time witnesses described, but the image quality dissolved into pixels when magnified. They could see someone wearing dark clothing walking east, away from the tram stop, but couldn't confirm the identity or track where the person went next. Emma Charlotte Fraser was born on November 3, 1975, in Bendigo, a regional city north of Melbourne. where her parents still lived in the same weatherboard house where she and Claire had grown up. Her father, Robert Fraser, worked for 40 years as a mechanical engineer at a local manufacturing plant. Her mother, Margaret, taught piano lessons from their living room. The sound of scales and chopinitudes formed the soundtrack of Emma's childhood. It was a stable upbringing, marked by Sunday roasts and school concerts, by the particular rhythm of provincial Australian life, where everyone knew your family and your business. From early adolescence, Emma showed an aptitude for visual observation that her teachers recognized as exceptional. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of Bendigo's Victorian-era architecture, the ornate post office and town hall, the mine poppet heads that punctuated the landscape like monuments to the city's gold rush history. At 16, she won a regional art competition with a charcoal portrait of her grandmother that captured something essential about agging and memory. Her art teacher, Miss Patricia Hamilton, would later tell detectives that Emma possessed not just technical skill, but emotional intelligence, an ability to see past surfaces into the complicated truths underneath. She moved to Melbourne in 1994 to study fine arts at RMIT University, living in student housing in Carlton and working part-time at a vegetarian cafe to cover expenses. The city transformed her. She discovered yoga during her second year, initially attending classes to manage anxiety, but finding in the practice something that complemented her artistic work, both disciplines requiring sustained attention and presence. After graduating in 1997, she completed yoga teacher training and began instructing while continuing to make art. The two activities balanced in a way that felt necessary rather than divided. Her relationship with Adam Sullivan began in September 2003 at a friend's birthday party in Prahan. He was 32 then, recently promoted to bar manager after years working in hospitality. Handsome in a way that came from confidence rather than conventional features, he had dark hair that fell across his forehead, and a way of focusing completely on whoever he was speaking with that made them feel singular and seen. Emma's friends would later admit they'd initially liked him, found him charming and attentive, before the relationship's texture began to change in ways difficult to articulate at the time. The early months appeared healthy. Sullivan attended Emma's gallery openings, introduced her to musicians and artists who frequented the Owl, seemed genuinely interested in her work, but gradually friends noticed shifts. He called multiple times during their gatherings, just checking in. He suggested she didn't need to spend so much time at her studio, that they should be together more often. When Emma mentioned teaching an evening yoga class, Sullivan questioned whether it was worth the money, whether she really needed to work those hours. These weren't demands exactly, more like gentle erosions of autonomy disguised as concern. By late 2004, the relationship had acquired undertones that worried Emma's inner circle. Sullivan monitored her phone, asked detailed questions about where she'd been and who she'd spoken with. He became sullen when she made plans that didn't include him. Jessica Wilson remembered an afternoon in January 2005 when Emma arrived at her apartment with red eyes, not from crying but from exhaustion. She'd been arguing with Adam about wanting more independence, Emma explained, and he'd responded by accusing her of not loving him enough, of preparing to leave. The conversation had lasted until 3 a.m, circular and depleting, Sullivan alternating between apologies and recriminations until Emma felt too tired to maintain her position. She ended the relationship on March 12, 2005, meeting Sullivan at a cafe in Collingwood during daylight hours with other people around. She planned what to say, kept it brief and clear. The relationship wasn't working. She needed space. She hoped they could both move forward. Sullivan had listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, then stood and left without responding. Over the following weeks, the flowers arrived at her apartment, bouquets of white roses with cards that read, "Thinking of you and hope you're well." Letters came, too, handwritten pages explaining how much he'd changed, how he understood now what he'd done wrong, asking for another chance to prove himself. The phone call came into the St Kilda Road station on July 8, 3 weeks after Emma Fraser's bag was pulled from the Yarra River. A woman named Linda Walsh reported seeing someone matching Emma's description at a bus stop on Fitzroy Street in St Kilda, standing beneath the streetlight near the SB Hotel around midnight on June 18. Walsh had been driving home from her shift as a nurse at the Alfred Hospital, and the image had stayed with her because the woman looked lost in a way that transcended simple disorientation. She'd been wearing dark clothing, and her hair was pulled back, auburn, catching the light. Walsh hadn't stopped because Melbourne streets at midnight were full of people waiting for buses, and nothing about the scene had seemed urgent at the time. But then she'd seen Emma's photograph on the news, and something in the bone structure, the slope of the shoulders, had struck her as familiar enough to warrant a call. Detective Harris dispatched officers to canvass the area immediately. They interviewed staff at the SB, showed Emma's photo to bartenders and security personnel who worked that weekend, but no one remembered her. They pulled security footage from nearby businesses, examined hours of grainy black and white recordings that showed crowds moving in and out of pubs, people smoking on corners, couples arguing and embracing. There were dozens of women with similar builds and hair color, but identifying any specific individual proved impossible. The footage quality in 2005 captured shapes and movements but rarely faces, and the lighting on Fitzroy Street after dark rendered everyone into shadows punctuated by occasional flares of street lamp illumination. A second sighting emerged on July 15th. A taxi driver named Peter Lombardi contacted police, claiming he picked up a fare from outside Flinders Street Station on June 20th who resembled Emma. The woman had been agitated, he recalled, kept looking over her shoulder as if watching for someone. She asked to be taken to Dandenong, a southeastern suburb nearly an hour away, but then changed her mind after 10 minutes and asked to be let out near Caulfield. She paid in cash and walked quickly away from the cab without waiting for change. Lombardi remembered because passengers rarely gave up money, and because her nervousness had made him uneasy. He'd noted it at the time, but hadn't connected it to the missing person case until he saw a television segment about Emma that included security footage from the gallery opening. Detectives followed this lead with the intensity of people grasping at substance in a case built mostly from vapor. They traced Lombardi's route through taxi company logs and obtained surveillance from buildings along the path. The timestamp matched his story, showing his cab stopping on Hawthorne Road near Caulfield Station around 11:30 p.m. A figure exited the passenger side and moved out of frame. Enhancement specialists worked on the footage for days, trying to extract facial features or identifying characteristics, but the distance and angle defeated them. The person could have been Emma, could have been 1,000 other women in Melbourne. That night, Claire Fraser drove to St Kilda to Caulfield, to every location where someone claimed to have seen her sister. She walked the streets with photographs, stopped strangers, left her phone number with shopkeepers and cafe owners. Her husband, David Thompson, took time off from his job as an electrician to help with the children, while Claire pursued shadows across Melbourne suburbs. She slept poorly, woke at 3 a.m. with her mind racing through scenarios that branched into increasingly dark possibilities. During the day, she maintained composure, but at night she lay awake imagining Emma confused, injured, held somewhere against her will but still alive, still waiting for rescue. The investigation team worked through August with diminishing returns. They received dozens of tips, each one demanding hours of follow-up that led nowhere substantial. Someone reported seeing Emma at a rest stop on the Hume Highway heading towards Sydney. Officers drove the route, interviewed service station staff, reviewed weeks of security footage. Nothing matched. Another caller insisted Emma was working at a cafe in Geelong under a different name. Detectives made the trip, showed her photograph to the manager, confirmed the employee in question was a different person entirely who shared only superficial similarities. By September, Detective Harris felt the case slipping into that category of investigations that consume resources without producing breakthroughs. His superintendent began asking pointed questions about allocation of personnel and whether the missing person case warranted continued intensive focus. The statistical reality was harsh but unavoidable. Adults disappeared for complicated reasons, sometimes by choice, often into circumstances that resisted investigation. Without evidence of foul play beyond the abandoned bag, without witnesses to violence or abduction, the case existed in bureaucratic limbo between missing person and suspected homicide. The website went live on November 3, 2005, what would have been Emma Fraser's 30th birthday. Claire had designed it herself, learning basic HTML through online tutorials during the evenings after her children went to bed. The homepage showed Emma's photograph from her university graduation, cap slightly askew, smile genuine and unguarded. Below it, text explained the circumstances of her disappearance, provided a timeline, asked anyone with information to contact Victoria Police or the family directly. Claire updated it weekly with news of the investigation, posted appeals for witnesses, shared memories contributed by Emma's friends. The website became a digital memorial that refused to accept death without proof, a liminal space where Emma remained perpetually present in past tense language. The official investigation scaled back substantially by early 2006. Detective Harris kept the case file active, but could dedicate only limited hours to it as new priorities demanded attention. He continued to follow leads when they emerged, but they came less frequently now. The initial media coverage having faded into the background noise of a city where people went missing with depressing regularity. Emma's case was added to the National Missing Persons Coordination Centre database. Her details were entered alongside thousands of others who had vanished into Australia's vast spaces and urban anonymities. Claire organised the first vigil on June 15, 2006, 1 year after Emma disappeared. 50 people gathered outside the Fitzroy Gallery where Emma had last been seen, holding candles in the winter evening as trams rattled past and commuters hurried toward home. Claire stood before them with a photograph of her sister and spoke about the impossibility of grief without closure, about loving someone who existed in grammatical uncertainty, neither definitively present nor confirmed gone. Her voice remained steady, but her hand shook slightly as she held the photograph. Several attendees would later recall thinking about their own siblings, their own families, the fragile architecture of connection that held people together across distance and time. The vigils became annual events, growing smaller each year but persisting with the stubborn dedication of those who refused to forget. By 2010, attendance had dwindled to perhaps 20 people, mostly family and Emma's closest friends. By 2015, it was Claire and her husband, Emma's parents, Robert and Margaret Fraser, now in their 70s, and 3 or 4 others who had known Emma well enough that her absence still created a specific hollow in their lives. They stood together in the cold each June, lighting candles and speaking her name, marking time's passage in a ritual that acknowledged both hope's gradual erosion and their unwillingness to surrender it completely. Robert Fraser retired in 2008. He spent his days maintaining the garden and avoiding the spare bedroom where Emma's childhood paintings still hung on walls. Margaret continued teaching piano but struggled to concentrate during lessons, her mind drifting during scales to wonder where her daughter might be, whether she was cold, whether she was suffering. They didn't speak often about Emma between themselves. The subject was too vast and painful for casual conversation, but she permeated their silence, present in every family gathering where her absence carved a space that couldn't be filled or forgotten. The investigating officers changed over the years as personnel moved departments or retired. The case file was transferred 3 times, each new detective inheriting a banker's box filled with witness statements, forensic reports, surveillance footage on degrading VHS tapes, and photographs that showed a young woman frozen in time while everyone around her aged. Each detective reviewed the materials with fresh eyes, hoping to find something predecessors had missed, but the case resisted revelation. Emma Fraser had walked out of a gallery into a winter evening and dissolved like breath into cold air, leaving behind only questions that multiplied without ever approaching answers. Tips still arrived sporadically at the police station, often prompted by anniversaries or when Emma's case was mentioned in media retrospectives about unsolved disappearances. Someone would call, claiming to have information, and an officer would take the statement, follow the lead to its inevitable dead end, and add another notation to a file that had grown thick with accumulated futility. In 2011, a psychic contacted police, insisting Emma's body was buried in the Dandenong Ranges near a specific hiking trail. Officers searched the area for 3 days, finding nothing. The Cold Case Unit of Victoria Police occupied the 3rd floor of a nondescript building in Port Melbourne, where Detective Senior Sergeant Rachel Anderson spent her days surrounded by filing cabinets containing the accumulated failures of decades. She had joined the unit in 2021 after 15 years working homicide, drawn to the possibility of resolution in cases that had calcified into bureaucratic permanence. The work required a particular temperament, an ability to maintain focus while swimming through information that previous investigators had already examined exhaustively. It meant believing that time and technology might eventually illuminate what human effort alone had missed. In March 2023, the unit received a grant to implement new data analysis software developed in partnership with the Australian Federal Police and several universities. The system was designed to cross-reference digital evidence from cold cases, looking for patterns and connections that might not have been apparent when the cases were initially investigated. It could process email metadata, reconstruct deleted files, analyze communication patterns across multiple platforms, and compare linguistic signatures in anonymous messages. The technology had proven successful in several interstate cases, identifying suspects through digital footprints they'd assumed were erased or too fragmentary to trace. Anderson assigned a junior detective, Connor Miller, to begin inputting data from unsolved missing person cases dating back to 2000. Miller was 28, technically proficient, someone who'd grown up with computers and understood their logic intuitively. He worked methodically through the files, scanning documents and entering information into the database, while the software ran analysis algorithms in background processes that sometimes took days to complete. Emma Fraser's case entered the system on April 12, 2023, nearly 18 years after she'd walked out of the Fitzroy Gallery. The breakthrough came from a source nobody had anticipated. In 2005, Emma had used an email account provided by a small local internet service provider called ConnectNet, a Melbourne-based company that had offered affordable dial-up and early broadband services during the pre-Google era. ConnectNet had been purchased by a larger telecommunications company in 2008, and its services discontinued, but the acquisition agreement had required retention of user data for legal compliance purposes. The servers containing this archived information had been transferred to a data center in Dandenong and essentially forgotten, their existence noted in acquisition paperwork but never accessed or reviewed. The new analysis software included protocols for searching defunct servers and archived databases, cross-referencing them against known suspects and persons of interest. When Miller input Adam Sullivan's details, the system flagged a connection that made him call Anderson over to his workstation immediately. The archived ConnectNet servers contained email accounts that Sullivan had maintained in 2005, accounts he'd never disclosed during the original investigation, and that detectives at the time would have had no way of discovering without subpoenas specifically targeting that provider. Anderson spent the next week working with digital forensics experts to access and reconstruct the archived emails. What they found was a correspondence conducted through anonymous accounts, messages sent between Sullivan's hidden email address and another account that appeared to have been created specifically for communicating with Emma. The emails dated from February through June 2005, beginning just before Sullivan and Emma's breakup and continuing until 3 days after her disappearance. The early messages were romantic, pleading, asking Emma to reconsider ending their relationship. By April, the tone had shifted toward accusation and surveillance. Sullivan wrote about seeing Emma at cafes with friends, about watching her leave her yoga studio, about knowing her schedule better than she realized. The final email, sent on June 18th at 2:00 a.m., 3 days after Emma vanished, was addressed not to Emma but to another account registered under the name Jason McGregor. The message was brief but incriminating in its implications. "Everything's handled. The phone and jacket are dealt with. Stick to what we discussed and there won't be any problems. Delete this immediately." McGregor's response came 4 hours later, equally terse. "Understood. Won't hear from me again about this." Both accounts had been created using false information and prepaid credit cards, but the metadata embedded in the emails contained IP addresses that forensic analysts could trace to specific locations and times. Anderson pulled Jason McGregor's records and found a man who'd been Adam Sullivan's friend since their school days in Northcote. McGregor was 51 now, worked as a warehouse supervisor in Footscray, had no criminal record beyond a drunk and disorderly charge in 1998. He'd been interviewed briefly during the original 2005 investigation as part of routine questioning of Sullivan's associates, but nothing in that interview had raised concerns. He'd claimed he barely knew Emma, had only met her twice, couldn't provide any useful information. The detectives at the time had noted his cooperation and moved on. Detective Senior Sergeant Rachel Anderson assembled her team in the Cold Case Unit conference room on May 3, 2023, spreading printouts of the recovered emails across the table like cards, in a game where the stakes were measured in years of stolen life and unresolved grief. The 4 detectives present understood they were looking at evidence that should have been discovered 18 years earlier, that might have prevented nearly 2 decades of uncertainty for Emma Fraser's family. Anderson kept her voice level as she outlined the investigative strategy, but privately, she felt the familiar anger that came from knowing how often crucial information existed just beyond the reach of initial investigations, waiting for technology or chance to reveal it. The first priority was establishing whether Adam Sullivan still lived in Victoria and whether surveillance would reveal behavior patterns worth examining before they moved to arrest. Database searches showed Sullivan had relocated to Perth in 2019, worked as a hospitality consultant for several restaurant chains, maintained what appeared to be a conventional middle-class existence in a suburb called Applecross. He'd married in 2012, divorced in 2017, had no children. His financial records showed steady employment and unremarkable spending patterns. On paper, he was exactly the kind of person who disappeared into ordinary life, someone neighbors would describe as quiet and professional if questioned. Jason McGregor remained in Melbourne, still working at the same warehouse in Footscray where he'd been employed since 2002. Surveillance teams observed him for 2 weeks, documenting his routines with the patience that characterized cold casework. He lived alone in a rental house in Sunshine West, drove a 15-year-old Toyota to work each morning at 6:00 a.m., stopped at the same fish and chip shop every Friday evening. He had a girlfriend who visited on weekends, a woman named Sharon Moore who worked as a dental receptionist. Nothing about his life suggested someone carrying the weight of complicity in a missing person case, but Anderson had learned long ago that guilt often wore the mask of normality, that people could compartmentalize their worst actions and proceed as if they'd never occurred. The breakthrough regarding the apartment came from property records cross-referenced against Sullivan's financial history. Detectives discovered that in 2004, Sullivan had co-signed a lease on a small unit in Dandenong under company name he'd registered for tax purposes related to freelance bartending work. The lease had been paid through automatic bank transfers until July 2005, 1 month after Emma's disappearance, when Sullivan had terminated the agreement and forfeited his security deposit. The unit's address had never appeared in the original investigation files. Sullivan had provided his Richmond apartment as his primary residence when questioned, and detectives had searched that location thoroughly without finding anything suspicious. The Dandenong property had changed hands multiple times since 2005. The current owner, an elderly woman named Betty Hamilton, who'd purchased it as an investment property in 2018, had rented it to various tenants before it sat vacant for the past year due to needed renovations. Anderson obtained a warrant and assembled a forensic team to examine the unit on May 18th. The apartment was small, one-bedroom, with a narrow kitchen and bathroom, located in a brown brick complex built in the 1970s, where the hallways smelled of carpet cleaner and old cigarette smoke. Despite years of ventilation, the forensic examination took 3 days. Technicians photographed every surface, took samples from walls and flooring, used luminol to test for blood traces that time and cleaning might have obscured. The apartment had been repainted multiple times, carpets replaced, fixtures updated, but forensic science in 2023 possessed capabilities that would have seemed impossible in 2005. Analysts could detect biological material in quantities measured in microscopic particles, extract DNA from surfaces scrubbed clean decades earlier. The critical evidence emerged from the basement storage area attached to the unit, a concrete space accessible through a narrow door in the kitchen. Previous tenants had apparently used it for boxes and seasonal items, but forensic examination revealed fiber evidence trapped in cracks between the concrete floor and walls, protected from cleaning by their inaccessibility. The fibers matched the composition and dye lot of the charcoal sweater Emma had been wearing the night she disappeared, a match confirmed through comparison with an identical sweater Emma's mother had kept in storage, purchased during the same shopping trip. Additional testing revealed biological material that DNA analysis confirmed belonged to Emma Fraser, trace evidence that indicated she had been in that basement for an extended period. The arrest team assembled at Melbourne Airport on October 14, 2024, coordinating with Western Australia Police for the simultaneous detention of Adam Sullivan in Perth. Detective Senior Sergeant Rachel Anderson had spent months building the case with the meticulousness required for charges filed nearly 2 decades after the crime, ensuring every piece of evidence could withstand judicial scrutiny and defense challenges. The recovered emails, the forensic evidence from the Dandenong apartment, Sullivan's undisclosed lease agreement, and the pattern of behavior documented in 2005 combined into a narrative that prosecutors believed would satisfy the burden of proof required for murder charges, even without a body. Sullivan was taken into custody at his workplace, a restaurant supply company in the Perth suburb of Osborne Park, just after 9:00 a.m. local time. Officers described him as composed during the arrest, showing neither surprise nor resistance as they read him his rights and secured handcuffs around his wrists. He asked for a lawyer immediately, speaking only to confirm his identity and declining to answer questions. The drive to Perth Watch House took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Sullivan sat in the back of the police vehicle, staring out the window at a city he'd moved to, perhaps believing distance equaled safety, that 18 years and 4,000 km would insulate him from consequences. Jason McGregor's arrest occurred simultaneously in Melbourne. Officers arrived at the Footscray warehouse where he'd just begun his shift, supervising the loading dock. Unlike Sullivan, McGregor's composure fractured immediately. He became agitated, insisted there must be a mistake, claimed he didn't know what they were talking about. His hands shook as officers placed him in the patrol car, and he vomited twice during the transport to the St Kilda Road station. His girlfriend, Sharon Moore, called his phone repeatedly, the ringtone audible from his confiscated belongings. Each unanswered call was a small erasure of the life he'd maintained, while carrying secrets that were now collapsing around him. The interrogation of Sullivan began 3 hours after his arrival in Melbourne, conducted in the same interview room where Detective Harris had questioned him 19 years earlier. Sullivan's lawyer, a criminal defense specialist named Patricia Gordon, sat beside him, projecting professional confidence while Sullivan maintained the careful neutrality he'd displayed throughout. Anderson led the interview, laying out the evidence methodically, the emails from the ConnectNet server, printed and arranged in chronological order, the forensic findings from the Dandenong apartment, the lease agreement he'd never disclosed, the timeline that placed him in possession of a secret location during the exact period Emma Fraser disappeared. Sullivan listened without visible reaction until Anderson described the fiber evidence and DNA recovered from the basement storage area. Something shifted in his expression then, not panic but recognition, the understanding that time and technology had betrayed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His lawyer called for a break, spent 30 minutes conferring with him in private. When they returned, Sullivan's demeanor had changed. The careful composure remained, but beneath it now was a kind of exhaustion, the weariness of someone who'd been running for nearly 2 decades and had finally stopped. What emerged over the next 6 hours of interrogation was a confession that transformed absence into narrative, speculation into documented fact. Sullivan admitted that Emma had agreed to meet him at the Dandenong apartment on June 15th, after leaving the gallery, a final conversation he'd requested to achieve closure on their relationship. She'd taken a taxi there around 10:30 p.m., arrived to find him drinking wine and playing music she'd once liked, an attempt at romantic atmosphere that she'd immediately recognized as manipulative. The conversation had escalated quickly, Sullivan pressing her to explain why their relationship couldn't work, Emma trying to maintain boundaries while feeling increasingly trapped in the small apartment with someone whose intensity had always frightened her slightly. He described his anger as sudden and overwhelming, a response to her repeated refusals that felt like negation of everything he'd invested in their relationship. They argued in the kitchen, voices rising until Emma had tried to leave. Sullivan blocked the door. She slapped him, he claimed, and he'd pushed her back harder than intended. She'd fallen, struck her head on the corner of the kitchen counter, collapsed to the floor, bleeding and unconscious. He'd panicked. He said he hadn't meant to hurt her, couldn't believe what had happened. He checked for a pulse and found none, confirmed later by a friend with medical knowledge that she was dead. The friend was Jason McGregor, who Sullivan had called immediately after Emma stopped breathing. McGregor had arrived within an hour, assessed the situation with the grim practicality of someone committed to protecting his oldest friend regardless of cost. Together, they'd wrapped Emma's body in plastic sheeting and moved it to the basement storage area while they decided what to do. Over the following 3 days, they disposed of the body in a location Sullivan refused to specify, even now, claiming he didn't remember exact details due to shock and the passage of time. They'd cleaned the apartment thoroughly, disposed of Emma's phone and jacket separately, and staged the discovery of her bag near the river to create the impression she might still be alive somewhere, confused or choosing to disappear. The courtroom in the Supreme Court of Victoria filled beyond capacity on March 4, 2025, for the sentencing hearing that would conclude a case spanning 2 decades. Claire Fraser sat in the front row beside her elderly parents, her husband David holding her hand with the steady pressure of someone providing anchor in turbulent water. Behind them, Emma's friends occupied several rows, many now in their late 40s and 50s, their faces marked by the years that had passed since they last seen the woman they'd known as vibrant and thoughtful, someone whose absence had carved permanent hollows in their understanding of the world's basic fairness. Adam Sullivan stood as Justice Margaret Wilson entered, his expression blank in the way of people who'd already accepted their fate. During the months of pretrial detention and legal proceedings, his defense team had negotiated extensively with prosecutors. Sullivan's confession and cooperation regarding Jason McGregor's role had resulted in murder charges rather than the aggravated murder the prosecution had initially pursued. He'd led police to a remote area in the Dandenong Ranges where he claimed Emma's body had been buried, but 19 years of weather and undergrowth had erased any physical evidence. Forensic teams had excavated the site without recovering remains, leaving Emma's family without even the grim closure of burial. Justice Wilson's sentencing remarks filled 30 minutes, her voice measured as she detailed the case's particulars and the aggravating factors that warranted significant punishment. Sullivan had killed Emma Fraser in an act of violence born from possessiveness and entitlement, then compounded that crime by concealing it for nearly 2 decades, denying her family any opportunity for closure or proper mourning. He'd continued his life with calculated normality while the Frasers existed in a state of perpetual uncertainty. The court acknowledged his eventual confession, but noted it had come only after irrefutable evidence emerged, suggesting self-interest rather than genuine remorse motivated his cooperation. The sentence was 23 years imprisonment, with a non-parole period of 18 years, accounting for time already served during pretrial detention. Sullivan would be 71 years old before becoming eligible for parole. His middle age and whatever remained of his vitality would be consumed by incarceration. He showed no reaction as Justice Wilson pronounced the sentence, was led from the courtroom by corrections officers without looking at Emma's family. His departure marked the end of his visible presence in their lives. though his actions would continue reverberating through their memories indefinitely. 2 months had passed since the trial of Jason McGregor came to its grim conclusion, a case that had lingered in headlines and haunted the Fraser family for nearly 2 decades. McGregor, once a name buried deep in the shadows of the investigation, now stood convicted of being an accessory after the fact to murder and for obstructing justice. His defense team painted him as a man broken by misplaced loyalty, someone who had been swept into horror by another's actions and paralyzed by fear and confusion. They claimed he hadn't meant harm, that he'd acted out of panic, not malice, and that his silence was the desperate reflex of a man cornered by circumstance. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. They argued that McGregor's involvement had been anything but passive, that his choices were deliberate, calculated, and persistent. For 19 years he had carried the weight of the truth, helping to hide what had been done, misleading investigators, and allowing Emma Fraser's loved ones to drown in uncertainty. His silence wasn't the result of confusion, it was complicity stretched across almost 2 decades. When Justice Thomas Kelly delivered the verdict, the courtroom held its breath. The sentence, 8 years imprisonment, with a non-parole period of 5, was measured, reflecting his secondary role but leaving no doubt about the gravity of his betrayal. The judge spoke of the immeasurable prolonging of human suffering, of how McGregor's silence had deepened the cruelty of an already unthinkable loss. The Fraser family, seated in the front row, didn't celebrate the verdict. There was no triumph in it. Only a kind of weary closure, the quiet exhale of people who had carried too much pain for too long. After Sullivan's sentencing, the man whose name had become synonymous with Emma's disappearance, Claire Fraser, stood outside the courthouse, clutching the folded pages of her victim impact statement. The sky above Melbourne was a pale, hard blue, and the air shimmered with the hum of news cameras and murmuring reporters. When she began to speak, her voice was steady, but tears slipped down her cheeks unheeded. She spoke not of revenge, but of the quiet, corrosive ache of grief without an end point. She described what it was like to live suspended between hope and despair, to celebrate birthdays and weddings and births with the constant shadow of someone missing, someone whose story had no ending. She spoke of her parents agging beneath the weight of uncertainty, of her children growing up with an aunt they only knew through framed photos and whispered stories. Grief, she said, is not only the presence of pain, it's the absence of answers, and that absence lives with you every day. Claire thanked the detectives who had refused to let Emma's case fade into cold storage, the forensic teams who followed digital trails through nearly 2 decades of technological evolution, and the strangers who had come to vigils, leaving candles and notes when the world had already moved on. The story of Emma Fraser had become more than a tragedy. It had become a lesson in persistence, proof that truth could survive time, buried within data, waiting for the right eyes and the right tools to uncover it. The investigation itself would go on to reshape the future of law enforcement in Victoria. The Cold Case Unit received a surge of funding, its digital forensics division expanding into a model of innovation. Algorithms began revisiting decades-old cases, uncovering connections no human detective could have recognized alone. Detective Rachel Anderson, whose tireless dedication had helped unearth the digital evidence that finally broke the case, gave a handful of careful interviews. She spoke about the balance between technology and instinct, about the ethics of data retrieval, and the strange, humbling feeling of solving something that had once seemed eternal in its silence. She refused to sensationalize Emma's story, refused to feed the morbid curiosity that always followed tragedy. Instead, she honored the work and the woman at its center. Emma Charlotte Fraser's name was later etched into the memorial wall at the Victorian Police Academy, a bronze plaque among dozens, each one a story of loss finally met with resolution. For her family, it was both comfort and heartbreak, a reminder that the end of the search did not mean the end of grief. In the years that followed, the Frasers found new ways to carry Emma forward. They created the Emma Fraser Memorial Scholarship at RMIT University, awarded to art students who demonstrated both technical mastery and social consciousness, the very values Emma had embodied in her short, luminous life. Claire, who had once built a website begging for information, transformed it into something else entirely, a living archive of her sister's work. There, Emma existed not as the mystery that consumed her story, but as the artist, the dreamer, the teacher, the woman who saw beauty in the ordinary and believed art could speak to the ache of being human. The site became a digital sanctuary, filled with scans of Emma's sketches, her unfinished projects, and her words. Visitors could wander through her art, feel her presence in the brushstrokes and graphite lines, and sense that even though her body was gone, her voice remained, gentle, searching, unafraid. And in that space, the story of Emma Fraser finally shifted, from disappearance to remembrance, from silence to expression. Not an ending, but a quiet continuation of who she had always been, an artist illuminating the unseen.